Okay, hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to be going over another Rook and Pawn endgame that I think is very instructive. If you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So in the last video I went over a Rook and Pawn endgame where I tried to explain the differences between central passers and outside passed pawns in Rook and Pawn endgames. So in this endgame, as you can see, we have an even number of pawns for each side, and white has a central passed pawn, or a potential central passed pawn, if he just makes the move pawn to d5, and it is white's move in this particular position. And black has a potential outside passed pawn, potentially on the b file. So the first question is, whose position is better right here? And of course the answer is actually white's position is slightly better. As previously discussed, the general principles for Rook and Pawn endgames are a little bit different than King and Pawn endgames and minor piece endgames. In Rook and Pawn endgames, the most important thing is whose pawn is further up the board, and actually central passed pawns tend to be a little bit stronger than outside passed pawns because the king typically needs to escort that central passed pawn. So the real question is what is the correct move here? And in order to find out what the correct move is here, we have to kind of break apart another misconception that a lot of people have about Rook and Pawn endgames. And I hear this all the time as if it's just this rule that has to be applied all the time, which is rooks belong behind passed pawns. And of course, that's true a lot of the time. This is one of those general principles that applies, very broadly a lot of the time. But more to the point, it's just one of these things that we say to beginners, and it makes sense. If we can get them putting the rook behind the pawn, that's certainly a lot better than other things they might do with their rook. Like trap it in front of the pawn and push the pawn up until the rook has nowhere to go, or defend it very weakly from the side of the pawn. Things like that. But in general, in Rook and Pawn endgames, rooks like to be active. As a matter of fact, if white wants to try to play for a win in this position, his best move is to play something like Rook c3. Because if white can play Rook c3 and then infiltrate with that rook on the 7th rank, white will have an absolutely huge position here. White will be doing very, very good, and white can proceed to start playing for a win from there. He has every opportunity to try to turn this position into a decisive advantage, and every opportunity to turn that decisive advantage into a win. But if he just keeps the rook behind the passed pawn, he's going to be throwing away a lot of that advantage. So let's say that white were to play something like d5 question mark. Now the rook is officially behind this passed pawn. This is the type of mistake I see a lot of lower rated players make in a position like this. A lot of their advantage just with d5 has already been thrown away. For example, let's say e takes d5, e takes d5. Now we have that central passed pawn. We're going to have king e7. Notice that the king is going to come in and defend. This is another good general principle. Usually the king is, best placed, blocking, this any passed pawn in a position. A king is best placed blocking that passed pawn. Notice that black doesn't have any passed pawns of his own right now. All his pawns are anchored and nailed down. So really it's just about, can black, get this pawn under wraps and stop it? And in this case he certainly can. Now, if white keeps playing kind of lazy chess, just thinking he has an advantage because he has a central passed pawn with a rook behind it, and doesn't, activate his rook and get it out from behind the pawn, if he keeps playing moves that are non-rook activation moves, he's going to end up in a lot of trouble. If he continues to push the pawn, he'll of course lose it. It'll get too far ahead of his king and his rook. So like if d6, king d7, rook c8 followed by rook c6, we're going to actually harvest that pawn. And it's going to be a serious problem. Now, if something like king d4, if we keep the king next to it, rook c8 is already decisive advantage black. Black is going to be able to get his rook out from behind his pawns, and he's going to be able to go active on the 7th rank himself. So in this position, it's really critical who's going active with their rook. So an example would be like rook d2 to at least block the rook from coming to the second. King d6, now we can see that we have dual threats. We have the rook coming to this active square, plus the threat of the rook still going to the 2nd rank, which needs to be blocked by the rook. White is in total defense mode here. White has basically what amounts to a completely lost position. So white can just make a random move, h4. Now black can start advancing his pawns, b5, h5, rook c4 check, and there's nothing here. Everything's hanging. King d3, and we can even just play a safety move. We can play a6, because everything in the position for white is hanging. Black's rook is just too active. It barely has anything to do with the passed pawns at this point. It just has to do with the active rook. Black hasn't even generated a passed pawn yet. So now after rook to d1, we would have rook a4, rook a1, and after a5, g4, h6, g5, hg5, king c2, king takes d5, white's position would be completely lost. All of white's pawns have fallen. And there was really no way for white to hold it past a certain point. There's not going to be any good moves here. If white moves his rook away, and notice this rook is positioned behind this pawn, it's a terrible position. White's passive, black is aggressive. So black's rook is more active than white's, and therefore black's position was better. So what is activity for a rook? A rook is active when it's sitting on an open file. A rook is going to be more active when it's sitting on an open file or threatening to infiltrate and attack enemy pawns, or threatening to infiltrate and go to the 7th rank. So from this initial position, did white have an advantage? Absolutely. White could have continued much similarly and just played rook c3. Now white has the advantage and black is on the back foot. And now if black plays, similarly and just tries to advance his passed pawn, black would get in equal amounts of trouble. We'll say rook, b5, rook c7. We could play e5, king b3, b4, takes. We're going to play rook c2. This is very similar, just in reverse. Now black is actually losing his advanced passed pawn. White's actually just going to end up trying to work this position into a win, trying to work, this 5-on-4 into a win, which is a very difficult position to win if it's even winnable. But white can certainly try. White can definitely, make some progress, and white can try. And, of course, there's many other ways that this could be played or that this could be tried. If black, does something kind of in between, like if black, kind of goes active but doesn't quite go active, or basically just loses a couple tempo on that particular line that we just looked at, where at least he went active with the pawn and lost it that way, white could actually get a super active position without a lot of fight and make it extremely difficult for black to save. If we had something like this and then black didn't go active here with rook c1, which is totally necessary, if he does something else, like if he plays rook b8, he's getting in trouble within this passive setup. We're going to play king d4. We've got a central passed pawn and we've got an active rook. And we don't have a way for black to actually generate a passed pawn without hanging material. So white should be completely winning here. So an example would be if b5, we have rook a5. Obviously this position is completely winning. Now if we go back to black going active, this is probably the best attempt to defend, is just to go active at this point. But even here, we would simply play king e4, rook e1 check, and then king f4, something like this, should still be decisive advantage white. White's threatening to advance this pawn and make a queen. Actually, as soon as the pawn goes to d6, things get pretty tight for this king. We have to create an escape score for the king. Also, it's still impossible to advance these pawns without the rook capturing them. This should still be decisive advantage white, but this at least offers black some sort of survival chances, because at least he's got the rook on a square that's kind of active that can attack white's pawns. It's behind the pawns, and it can kind of help defend. But really, black is probably just going to be on the back foot here. He's probably just going to be losing kind of one way or another. I think probably the best case scenario is after rook c3, black should just try to rapidly advance these pawns, give up the b pawn, and just try to hold the 4-on-3, and hopefully he can hold the draw. And that's kind of the way I would play it here. Black could just kind of hunker down, shuffle back and forth, and just say, okay, white, how are you going to make progress? And that's probably the right way to defend. So anyways, from the initial position, the basic brief of this lesson is the rooks don't necessarily belong behind pawns in a rook and pawn endgame. Rooks, generally speaking, will belong in one of three places. They'll belong behind your pawns, and behind passed pawns that are being pushed. That's number one. Number two, rooks belong on open files, or they belong on the 7th rank. So rooks need to go active, they need to attack enemy pawns on the 7th rank, or they need to go active and go on open files. So those are the main locations that rooks belong in, and you have to base your decision on how to play the position based on the specifics of each position you're given. How far up the board are your pawns? how far up the board are your passed pawns, how close is their king to coming in and defending, and factors like that. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.